When the microphone crackled to life, nobody expected what followed. The graduation hall, moments before filled with cheers and applause, fell into a stunned silence. It wasn't a congratulatory anthem or a booming speech. Instead, a trembling voice rang out, raw, full of love and history. The voice didn't come from the stage. It came from a USB drive, handed discreetly to the principal before the ceremony began. And the man behind the voice? He had already walked away. The voice carried through the auditorium like a ghost. It ended simply. "Congratulations, son, if you still remember your father." And in that moment, the entire room held its breath. What followed would remind everyone present why some words should never be left unsaid. Thomas J. Keller, 62 years old, had spent most of his life with grease under his fingernails and quiet hope in his heart. For 35 years, he worked as a mechanic at a truck repair shop in the suburbs of Boise, Idaho, fixing engines most people had given up on. When his wife, Sarah, died of cancer, Thomas was left to raise their 7-year-old son, Andrew, alone. No college degree, no family money, no influential connections. Just a steady paycheck and an unwavering belief that love, steady and true, could bridge any gap. For 17 years, Thomas did everything a single father could do. He attended every parent-teacher conference, sitting in tiny plastic chairs built for people half his size. He learned to braid hair for school picture day, even though his thick, calloused fingers struggled with the delicate strands. He saved every report card, every drawing, every award. What started as a shoebox of keepsakes turned into 3. When Andrew showed promise in mathematics, Thomas took on double shifts to pay for tutoring. When Andrew wanted to join the debate team, Thomas bought him his first suit from a thrift store and spent hours helping him rehearse arguments about topics he barely understood. But college changed everything. Andrew earned a full scholarship to study engineering at Stanford University. For the first time in his life, he was surrounded by peers whose parents were doctors, lawyers, executives, people who spoke with Polish, wore crisp collars, and never had oil stains on their hands. At first, the phone calls home came frequently. Then they grew shorter, then less frequent, then they stopped altogether. "I'm busy, Dad. I'll call you later," Andrew said. But later never came. Still, Thomas kept sending monthly allowance checks. He set up automatic tuition transfers for anything the scholarship didn't cover. He even bought a second-hand computer and learned to use email, sending messages that were rarely answered. The shoebox collection grew to include newspaper clippings about Andrew's academic success, screenshots of his name on the dean's list, and university photos of him accepting honors. Andrew never once mentioned his father in any speech, any profile, any thank you. As graduation approached, Thomas waited for an invitation that never came. He waited for a call, a message, some sign that his son remembered the man who had raised him. He found out about Andrew's graduation only through an article online. Valedictorian, the top of his class. The piece mentioned a job offer from a prestigious engineering firm in San Francisco, with a starting salary higher than Thomas had ever made in 3 years. There was no mention of family, no quote about sacrifices, no thank you to the man who had been there for every scraped knee, every sleepless night, every triumph. Still, Thomas bought a train ticket to California. He packed his one good shirt, the navy blue one he wore to church. He brought his old camera, hoping to take photos from the back of the auditorium. And he brought something else, a USB drive, containing a song he had recorded in his small apartment, a song he wrote himself, a final gift his son didn't know he needed. The night before his trip, Thomas sat at his kitchen table and wrote a letter he would never send. In it, he forgave his son for growing beyond him. He apologized for not being the kind of father who could belong in Andrew's new world. And he explained that love doesn't need acknowledgement to be real. The next morning, he boarded the earliest train west, carrying with him his quiet offering, a message wrapped in melody and memory. At Stanford University, the auditorium buzzed with pride and anticipation. Families filled every seat, their faces glowing, cameras poised to capture memories they'd treasure for a lifetime. Some held flowers, others brought glittered signs. Entire rows were claimed by families in matching t-shirts emblazoned with graduation photos. Not. Thomas arrived 3 hours early, not because he had special seating, but because he wanted to find a place where he could see his son without being seen. He chose a seat in the very back row, hidden partly behind a pillar. His navy blue church shirt was neatly pressed, and he wore a tie Sarah had given him on their anniversary 15 years ago. In his weathered hands was a small program he had printed from the university website, Andrew's name highlighted in yellow marker. As families streamed in, Thomas watched the elaborate celebration unfold. An elderly woman nearby noticed him sitting alone. "First grandchild graduating?" she asked kindly. Thomas smiled faintly. "My son, but he probably won't notice I'm here." The woman looked puzzled, but before she could ask more, the ceremony began. 2 hours earlier, Thomas had visited the university's administration building, asking to speak with someone in charge of the graduation program. He was eventually led to Dr. Patricia Martinez, the Dean of Student Affairs, a woman in her 50s who had dedicated her life to education and had seen every type of family dynamic imaginable. "Mr. Keller?" she said, reading his name off the intake form. "How can I help you today?" Thomas gently placed the USB drive on her desk, his hand shaking ever so slightly. "My son, Andrew Keller. He's the valedictorian today. We haven't spoken in over a year. He's built a life for himself, and I get that. But I made something for him, a song. I was wondering if, after his speech, you might be able to play it." Dr. Martinez studied him closely, sensing the weight behind his words. "What kind of song, Mr. Keller?" "Just a father, singing to his son. Nothing fancy. I recorded it on an old cassette and had someone at the computer store transfer it." "Have you tried contacting him directly?" Thomas nodded. "For 2 years, but he's busy building a future. I don't want to be what holds him back." Dr. Martinez, a mother of 3 grown children herself, understood the tension between supporting your children and stepping aside to let them grow. She also recognized the heartbreak of a parent left behind. "I'll need to listen first," she said gently. "But if it's appropriate, I think we can find a way." When Thomas left her office, he felt lighter than he had in months. He spent the hours before the ceremony walking the campus, quietly tracing his son's footsteps. He saw the library where Andrew had studied, the engineering building where he had spent so many late nights, the dorm where he had once lived. And now, back in the auditorium, Thomas sat quietly, watching the procession of caps and gowns. When Andrew appeared, walking confidently among the honor students, Thomas's breath caught in his throat. His son looked every bit the part. Polished, professional, proud. His shoulders were straight, his smile dazzling. He carried himself like a man who knew exactly where he was going. The ceremony unfolded with the usual speeches, talks of potential, of change, of the power of knowledge. Then came Andrew's turn. His speech was eloquent, heartfelt, inspiring. He spoke of innovation, of responsibility, of building a better world. He thanked professors, classmates, the university. He never once mentioned his father. From the back, Thomas watched. Andrew's girlfriend sat in the front row along with her parents, who had apparently become family to him. Professors flanked the seats nearby. Classmates cheered. Thomas realized then what he had tried to avoid admitting. His son had built a full and happy life, one that simply didn't include him. As Andrew concluded his speech to thunderous applause, Dr. Martinez returned to the podium. "Before we conclude today's ceremony," she said, her voice warm, "we have a special presentation, a message left for one of our graduates from someone who couldn't be here in person." Thomas's heart pounded as he saw her insert the USB drive. In 30 seconds, 800 people would hear the voice of a father reaching out, hoping to remind a son of something he once knew. Andrew, unaware, sat still in the front row. Hey, type forgive me if you've ever taken someone's love for granted. Comment their name below. Just write what you'd say if they could hear you now. The room fell completely silent. Dr. Martinez stepped back from the microphone. And across the packed auditorium, parents, students, friends, and strangers waited, each of them about to witness a moment they would never forget. Then the music began. It wasn't the polished production one might expect at a university ceremony. The sound was raw, unfiltered, clearly recorded on amateur equipment, perhaps in someone's living room. A simple guitar melody played, the fingers not quite steady, accompanied by the faint hum of an old recording device. Then came the voice. When you took your first steps, my hands shook more than yours did. The voice was deep and weathered, carrying the weight of decades of unspoken words. It wavered slightly, not from a lack of singing ability, but from emotion barely held in check. When you left for school, I learned how to hold my breath. In the back row, Thomas closed his eyes, mouthing along with the words. He had written this song in his small apartment just 3 weeks ago. He had practiced it dozens of times, trying to get it right, trying to pour 17 years of love into 3 minutes of melody. On stage, Andrew froze. His face went pale as recognition dawned. He knew that voice. It was the same voice that had sung him to sleep when he was small, the same voice that had cheered at his Little League games, the same voice he had been avoiding for the past 2 years. And today, you're standing there, if you still remember. The audience began to understand they were witnessing something deeply personal. A young mother in the third row wiped her eyes with a tissue. An elderly grandfather reached for his wife's hand. Even the faculty members seated on stage seemed visibly moved by the raw honesty in the voice pouring through the speakers. The guitar carried on, simple and unpretentious, as the voice sang about bedtime stories and scraped knees, about teaching a boy to ride a bike and then watching him drive away to college. Each verse was a memory. Each chord, a year of love given freely, without expectation of return. I taught you to be strong, maybe too strong to need your old man. Jessica, Andrew's girlfriend, looked at him, confusion and growing concern etched across her face. He had never mentioned his father. She had assumed he was either an orphan or that his parents had died. In 2 years of dating, Andrew had not spoken a single word about the man whose voice now filled the auditorium with love and regret. But if you're listening to this, then maybe I did something right. Dr. Martinez, still standing by the microphone, fought back tears. In 30 years of education, she had witnessed every kind of family dynamic, but never something quite like this. A father's love, laid bare for hundreds of strangers to hear, all for the chance that his son might finally understand. The song continued, each verse painting a picture of sacrifices made gladly, of love offered without conditions, of pride in a son who had grown beyond the father's humble world. I worked double shifts so you could have what I never did. In the audience, parents began thinking about their own children, their own sacrifices, their own hopes that love would be enough to bridge any gap. Some reached for their phones, suddenly overcome with the need to call their parents. Then came another verse. I learned to use email, just to send you words you'd never read. The line hit Andrew like a physical blow. He remembered those emails, dozens of them, that he had deleted without opening. Messages his father had carefully typed, 2 fingers at a time, on a computer he had bought just to stay connected with his son. But that's okay. That's what fathers do. We love without keeping score. The auditorium was completely silent, save for the voice on the recording and the quiet sounds of people crying. Hardened professors wiped their eyes. Students who had come to celebrate their achievements now found themselves reflecting on the people who had made those achievements possible. From the back row, Thomas watched as his son struggled with emotions long buried. This was what he had hoped for. Not forgiveness necessarily, but recognition, understanding. A moment in which Andrew might remember that love doesn't vanish just because it goes unacknowledged. The guitar melody began to wind down, the voice prepared for its final verse. So congratulations, son, on becoming the man I always knew you'd be. Andrew's hands were shaking. He looked out into the audience, scanning the rows of faces, suddenly desperate to find the man whose voice had reached across years of silence to touch his heart. I hope when you have children, you'll tell them about their grandfather. The song neared its end, but before the final chord, one last message, spoken rather than sung, emerged from the speakers, barely audible, yet crystal clear in the silent auditorium. Congratulations, Andrew Keller, from the man who used to be your father. The recording ended. For a few long seconds, 800 people sat in complete silence. Then, the auditorium erupted, not in applause, but in something deeper. The sound of people moved beyond words. Students hugged their parents tighter. Faculty members exchanged tearful glances. Strangers reached out to comfort each other. On stage, Andrew stood motionless, tears streaming down his face, looking out at the crowd with new eyes. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his future, his career, or his accomplishments. He was thinking about the man who had made it all possible. The man who had loved him enough to sing one last song, even if he never received a reply. Somewhere in that auditorium was his father, and Andrew suddenly realized that finding him was the most important thing he would ever do. But when the ceremony ended and Andrew pushed through the crowd to the back of the auditorium, the seat behind the pillar was empty. Thomas had done what he came to do. He had given his son the gift of understanding, wrapped in 3 minutes of melody and a lifetime of love. Now it was up to Andrew to decide what to do with that gift. 3 days after graduation, Andrew stood outside a small apartment building in East Boise, Idaho. The address had taken him hours to track down. His father had moved from their old family home 2 years ago. Around the same time Andrew had stopped taking his calls. The landlord, Mrs. Chen, was an elderly woman who spoke with a slight accent. She looked at Andrew with curiosity mixed with sadness. You're Thomas's boy, she said. It wasn't a question. He showed me your picture from the newspaper, said you were graduating from some fancy college. Is he here? Andrew asked, his voice hoarse from crying during the 8-hour drive from California. Mrs. Chen shook her head slowly. He moved out 3 days ago, said he was going on a long trip, didn't say where. She studied Andrew's face for a long moment. But he left something for you. Said if you ever came looking, I should give it to you. She disappeared into her apartment and returned with a cardboard box, the kind used for moving. Andrew's name was written on the top in his father's careful handwriting. He paid rent for another month, Mrs. Chen added softly. Said maybe you'd need a place to think. Andrew carried the box upstairs to the now empty apartment. The key Mrs. Chen had given him opened the door to a bare space. Only a folding chair remained, placed beside the window. On the wall, a single note was taped. It was in his father's handwriting. Andrew, if you're reading this, then the song found you. I hope it helped you remember what you already knew, that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real. The box has some things I thought you might want. The apartment is yours for the month if you need time to figure things out. Love, Dad. Andrew sat in the folding chair and opened the box with trembling hands. Inside were treasures he thought long lost, his first-grade art projects, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. Photos from Little League games, with Thomas always in the background, cheering. Report cards with his father's proud comments scrawled in the margins. A program from Andrew's high school graduation, every mention of his name highlighted in yellow. No. At the bottom of the box was a leather journal Andrew had never seen before. The first entry was dated the day he left for college. September 15th. Drove Andrew to the airport today. He's so excited about Stanford. I'm proud and terrified. The house feels too quiet without his music playing upstairs. Andrew read entry after entry, chronicling his father's life over the past 4 years. Thomas wrote about working extra shifts to cover expenses Andrew never knew about. He wrote about learning to use Facebook just to glimpse his son's life. He wrote about attending a parenting class to better understand how to support a child moving into a world beyond his own experience. But mostly, Thomas wrote about pride. Pride in Andrew's achievements. Pride in the man he was becoming. Pride in having raised someone strong enough to build his own life. The final entry was dated a week before graduation. Tomorrow I leave for California. I don't know if Andrew will listen to the song, but I had to try. Some gifts are more for the giver than the receiver. I needed him to know that letting go doesn't mean loving less. Andrew closed the journal and cried. For the father he had pushed away and the years they had lost. But more than grief, he felt determination. Finding Thomas wouldn't be easy. His father had never used credit cards or social media. He moved through the world quietly, leaving few digital traces. But Andrew was an engineer now. He understood systems. He understood persistence, something his father had always given him. The search would take months, but Andrew had finally learned what truly mattered. Not everyone gets a second chance to say sorry. Not everyone is lucky enough to receive a song, to recognize loss before it becomes permanent. Thomas didn't want recognition or awards. He just wanted his son to hear his voice one more time. The voice of someone who had held his hand through every winter of his childhood. And in an auditorium filled with bright lights, a song recorded on aging equipment had silenced hundreds of people and brought one son back home. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a final gift. From a father who had been forgotten. 6 months after graduation, Andrew found Thomas working at a small auto repair shop in Oregon. Their eyes met across the garage bay, and for a long moment, neither man spoke. Thomas wiped his hands on a shop rag and walked slowly toward his son. "You found me," he said simply. "You left me a map," Andrew replied, pulling out the worn journal. "I just had to learn how to read it." They talked for hours that day. About missed calls and unread emails, about pride and fear, and the many different ways people show love. Andrew learned that his father had moved to Oregon to be near a program for single parents, volunteering his time to help other fathers navigate the complicated relationships with their grown children. I realized, Thomas said, that maybe my experience could help someone else avoid the silence. Andrew moved to Oregon 6 months later, accepting a job with a local engineering firm. It paid less than his offer in San Francisco, but it kept him close to the man who had raised him. Every Sunday, they worked together in Thomas's small garage, fixing cars and rebuilding something far more important. The bond between a father and son who had learned that love is patient enough to wait for understanding. On Father's Day that year, Andrew gave Thomas a gift. A professionally recorded version of the graduation song with Andrew singing harmony to his father's original melody. Some relationships can be repaired. Some goodbyes can be undone. And sometimes, the most important conversations happen not in words, but in 3 minutes of music and a lifetime of second chances. Subscribe if you believe that some goodbyes deserve to be heard. This is a story from AZN Stories, where honor lives on, one voice at a time.